Welcome to the Can't Make This Up History Podcast. Kevin here, bringing you a true crime episode this week. One of the easternmost provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, is a pleasant and scenic place to visit today, but it has a colorful and sometimes checkered history. From bank robbers who used P.T. Barnum's circus as a diversion, to voters who went to the polls brandishing clubs and pistols, to the world's largest man-made explosion until the testing of the atomic bomb, Nova Scotia's history is filled with unbelievable yet true tales. In this episode, I am joined by a returning friend of the podcast, Dean Jobb. Dean is a professor of journalism and a member of the faculty of the Master of Fine Arts in Creative Nonfiction Program at the University of King's College in Halifax. He has an enduring interest in true crime and has written several books on the subject. Dean joins me again to discuss his latest book, Daring, Devious, and Deadly, True Tales of Crime and Justice from Nova Scotia's Past, which is a collection of 15 remarkable true crime stories. After you're done listening to today's episode, if you want to listen to Dean's first appearance on the podcast, check out Empire of Deception with Dean Jobb from February 2019. There is a link to that episode down in your description for this episode in your podcast app. Now on to Daring, Devious, and Deadly with Dean Jobb.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
Dean Jobb, welcome to the podcast again. Welcome back.
Well, thanks, Kevin.
Very glad to hear your voice again. It's been about a year and a half since we spoke before. Last time we talked about your book, Empire of Deception, which was wonderful. But you're back again today, talking about a new book, Daring, Devious, and Deadly, True Tales of Crime and Justice from Nova Scotia's Past. So thank you so much for coming back.
Well, thank you.
So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and what interests you in true crime.
Well, I started my career. I'm now an academic. I teach in a journalism program and a nonfiction writing master's program at a university in Halifax. I'm from Nova Scotia. My background in university was local history, of history of Nova Scotia and Canada. And my first job 30 some years ago in journalism was covering the courts. When I started out. So as I was covering contemporary trials, I got interested in the history of law, and that led to uncovering older cases, and that made true crime kind of a passion. And what I think is certainly as someone writing about true crime, if you're trying to engage a reader, these are dramatic stories. I mean, there's always a lot at stake. I mean, there's a tragedy, there's some violation or laws broken, someone's harmed, there's a victim, there's the hunt for perhaps the suspect who may have fled, or certainly the quest for justice to ensure that the right person is on trial, and the courtroom drama of whether or not the evidence will be there to convict the guilty, or if someone who's innocent may actually not be exonerated. So they're great stories, but they also are a window on the past. They show people at their best in this quest for justice. They also show people at their worst in terms of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. And I think they bring history alive in a way that the veneer of the sort of the respectable way people want to be remembered. This is different. This is people behaving badly. This is people at their worst. And it can really give you an insight into human nature and society. And I suppose the lesson is people haven't changed all that much. Some of us are as greedy and capable of unethical or or illegal behavior as we were in the past.
Yeah, I think that aspect of, these are real stories about real people that really make it fascinating, because I mean, I'm sure we've all watched crime drama or CSI or something like that, and they're interesting and compelling, but at the end of the day, that there's something that a writer cooked up in their imagination.
Mhm.
The fact that these stories actually happened, and sometimes in very sensational and unbelievable ways, just makes it really compelling.
Yeah, and it's essential. It should go without saying that true crime's true, but we see movies based on true crime and based on a true story, inspired by a true story. But in my craft, this is what happened. I don't speculate. I don't embellish. If I don't know what something looked like from contemporary descriptions or old photos, I don't use it. But I make the most of what I can find, and there's just a trove of material. I have cases going back 100, 150 or more years. And a lot of those, if there's court records or case reports because of appeals that led to some refinement of the law that meant these cases were preserved, I exploited those. But what I found was the early journalists uh, produced verbatim reports, virtually transcripts of trials. And that's an insight into people's relationship to true crime. There's a renaissance now. TV shows, podcasts, websites, internet sleuths doing their own investigation of cold cases. I mean, there's an explosion of interest in true crime. But if you look at old newspapers, some of them might have had only 4 pages, and easily they'd hand two over, 2 whole pages, no illustrations, just blow by blow, word by word account of a major trial. So people have always been absorbed with this. And I think, like you say, I mean, this isn't a story that may still have a morality tale, but being made up or embellished. I mean, this stuff really happened, and real people's lives were affected or at stake.
So you've written on other true crime topics in the past. So what made you decide to look at your the place where you live and pick out 15 um, little vignettes of true crime stories?
Well, these were some of the first cases I started to dig into when I got into true crime, and over the years, I just started to collect. I think I should place Nova Scotia for your listeners. Well, it's an East Coast province, east of Massachusetts. If you looked at a map of North America, there's something that sticks out almost like an appendage just above and east of Maine, and that's the province of Nova Scotia. It's virtually an island. There's only a few dozen miles strip of land that attaches us to mainland Canada. So it's a seafaring province. That meant there were lots of great stories about piracy and murder. And also, it was it was the first colony in what became Canada that was settled or founded by British. So it was the first part of what's now Canada to have British common law. So we have an older legal history than the rest of Canada, and it stretches back to the mid 1700s.
And I will say, because I've been to Nova Scotia, to Halifax, very briefly as part of a cruise. He stopped into Halifax for 6 hours or whatever it was. But some of the best seafood I've ever had in my life.
Yes, the seafood is great.
All right. Well, how did you, before we get into specific stories, how did you go about researching?
Well, sometimes a chance reference. There's a couple of stories in this collection that the cases were mentioned in court because law is all about precedent. So I've got one case where the owner of a hotel in Halifax is charged with a crime of basically a form of criminal negligence. He was accused of failing to take proper safety measures to keep the hotel safe. And in 1939, 28 guests died in a major fire. That was mentioned because of a case I was covering. So I was intrigued and went back and researched that. Um, Once you start digging into old cases, others seem to pop up. If I go to a memoir by a judge or a lawyer looking for descriptions of characters in these stories, or to see if there's reference to the case, you trip over another case that looks intriguing. Um, I was also lucky that our archives here in Halifax, the provincial archives, has a card index that generations of archivists had kept. And as they were poking around in Nova Scotia history, if they saw an interesting case, they put it on an index card. Now, this is before the internet, and this isn't digitized. You couldn't Google this, but I could actually flip through one of the old, if you remember, libraries that had card indexes. I could flip through under Crime Nova Scotia, and several cases came out of that, just this little potpourri of, or this gold mine for me, of cases. Some were interesting. Actually, that's how I found the story of Empire Deception, which is about a 1920 Chicago Ponzi schemer, highly successful, but when his scheme collapses, he comes up and hides out in Nova Scotia, spending his money as quickly as he can under an assumed name. And that's how I found his crazy story of this guy who claimed to have oil wells in Panama and hoodwinked hundreds, if not thousands, of people in Chicago for almost 2 decades. And that was all because came across a card. And I remember the day I did clearly, because I thought, now there's a story. And I was right.
That's amazing how you can just stumble upon those things by happenstance.
Well, I get asked sometimes, where do you come up with these ideas? And, they do come from digging. I mean, it comes from knowing where to look. I mean, if you know there's a card index like that. But also, I had an idle afternoon and I sat down with the old leather-bound case reports for Nova Scotia. It doesn't have every case. It only would have a smattering of criminal cases, but I just leafed through and I found several in there, just because the case report would say enough about it to say, okay, I should go back and find this. Once you've got the dates, unless you've got the advantage of digitized newspapers like you do now, once you have the dates, then you can pull up the newspapers. A lot of them are only on microfilm, and then find the case, the news reports, and follow the case from there.
All right. Well, let's dive into some of these then. Your book's organized in it's got some different sections dealing with court trials and bank robberies and disasters and so forth. But which of all these stories, you have 15 of them, which of these ones would you say is your favorite?
Well, I think it has to be, and this is one that will resonate with your audience. It involves no lesser a figure than P.T. Barnum of circus fame.
That was the one I was gonna for sure ask that we talk about.
Well, in 1876, he set up his big top in Halifax for the first time, and this was huge in a city of maybe 10, 20,000. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people, way more than the population, turned out over successive days to see the wonders, the exotic animals, the performers. And one thing Barnum did, he'd come to town with a huge train, and then to drum up business, not that there wasn't excitement about it, but he would stage a parade through the center of whatever town he was in. So in the summer of 1876, to promote his show, his circus wagons, the exotic animals, the performers, all paraded through the center of Halifax, and they went right by the main branch of one of the biggest banks in Halifax, the Bank of Nova Scotia. And the clerks inside couldn't resist the show. So they all grabbed their hats, ran outside to the sidewalk to watch the show. One of them was certain he locked the door behind him. And they were only out for about 15 minutes. The parade goes by. And when they come in, they start to go about their work. And First, one clerk realizes his cash box is gone. He accuses his desk neighbor of hiding the money as a prank. The other guy's money's gone, and as it turned out, more than $22,000, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's term, were gone. And it had turned out someone had gone in the back while the bank was empty, cleaned out what desks he could, and made off with the money.
That is an amazing way of exploiting a distraction.
That's right. And according to some of the press reports, this happened in other towns too. In fact, another office was robbed during the parade in Halifax. And a few days before, in another town, another robbery had been committed. So there were even allegations or suggestions that there were robbers who followed in Barnum's wake using this distraction.
And that certainly would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
All right. So what about another section you talk about is disasters. The very famous Halifax Explosion, which you talk about. When I was in grad school, I took a course on a Canadian Studies course, which was really interesting. I was exposed to this idea of the Halifax Explosion. Tell us a little bit about that. That's just the grand scale event.
Well, this is the what happened in 1917 in Halifax. Halifax was a major assembly point for convoys in the First World War, as it would be in the Second. And by chance, a munition ship laden with powerful explosives was coming into the harbor at the same time. A ship filled with supplies. It was a Belgian relief ship. It was taking supplies to help war-torn Belgium. The munition ship was only stopping in Halifax on its way overseas. The two ships collided in the harbor, right in the midst of the city. Nobody knew what was on board, other than the crew of this munition ship Mont Blanc, who fled in boats. Within about 20 minutes, the boat exploded, and the ship exploded, and it was so much munitions that it was the largest man-made explosion before the atomic age. So before the tests that led up to Hiroshima, it devastated the city, flattened it in a way that, on a smaller scale, would be reminiscent of what's left by an atomic bomb. In fact, it was large enough to create a mushroom cloud. And almost 2,000 people died, and almost 10,000 more were injured. Some of them horribly maimed for life. Many blinded because the fire in the harbor on this ship had attracted people to their windows. And as soon as the explosion happened, the shockwave sent glass flying into everyone's faces. So a huge disaster. And why it's in a book about true crime is there was a hue and cry, especially in the press, some of the Halifax papers. Well, what had happened? This wasn't an act of God. How could these ships have collided? And there was an immediate search, a demand that someone be held responsible. And in the wake of the explosion, the captain of the munition ship, the local pilot who was bringing it into the harbor, and a government official who was in charge of harbor traffic were all charged with manslaughter and prosecuted.
So they actually survived the explosion.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
Because the Mont Blanc captain and crew did escape. They were roundly, of course, reviled for surviving this disaster. And there was evidence that once they got to shore, they tried to warn people, but there was no easy way to warn people in the harbor about what was there. What became interesting to me in this case was, first of all, the power of the press to whip up almost an hysteria. I mean, there was allegations or rumors that German agents, that this was sabotage. German agents were behind it. None of it was true. And what happened? These three men were only saved, as it turned out, as I did my research, because one judge went against the tide, a judge named Benjamin Russell of the Supreme Court, who had been involved in helping victims after the explosion. I mean, this affected the entire city. But he was determined that these three men wouldn't be scapegoats. And he even said in court, he said, are these men to go to prison because of a mistake? He goes, nobody intended for this to happen. And in fact, there was good evidence that it wasn't the munition ship that was at fault. It was the other ship, the Belgian relief ship that hit it, that was at fault, was in the wrong place in the harbor. And ultimately, this judge put himself at considerable risk. I mean, he heard stories of people in the street basically making threats against him because there was so much understandable hurt in the community and outrage.
So you can definitely do a lot of analysis in how people respond to tragedies and things that are very difficult to understand, where we want to find a simple good guys, bad guys explanation for those types of things.
And it was nice to, it was good, I think, to bring that dimension to this. Same with the hotel fire I talked about. I mean, that's a dramatic story and a disaster. In fact, that was the worst disaster in 1939 when this hotel burned down and 29 guests died. That was the worst disaster in Halifax after the Halifax explosion. They both led to criminal cases. But it also shows that, there's a variety of potential crimes that can come out of tragedy. And again, there is a very human desire to see someone held accountable. And depending on the circumstances, that could indeed be justified. The captain or crew, or certainly the helmsman of the ship that caused the Halifax explosion, perhaps could have been prosecuted, but as it turned out, they died in the explosion.
For some kind of negligence or something like that.
Yeah, because, and again, in this case, the negligence may have existed, but it was directed against the wrong people who, really had the bad fortune, if you can call it that, but they'd survived. So these became, the ire of the community and the weight of the criminal law becomes focused on them.
One thing that might give listeners perspective on this, if they're not familiar with the Halifax explosion, is it, and I just thought about this as we're talking, the Beirut explosion, which happened earlier this year, somewhat of a similar circumstance. I don't know if it's comparable in terms of size, but very quickly people were trying to ascertain who caused this, who's to blame here.
Yes, and actually listeners may have heard of the Halifax explosion because of that, because it was compared similar situation in the sense we're not talking wartime, we're talking about peacetime and some kind of absolute tragic convergence of events, negligence or otherwise. Certainly the death toll in the Beirut explosion was much lower, but the devastation was very similar. And I can't emphasize enough what an incredible the scale of the disaster in Halifax. I mean, it was such complete devastation. I have a picture in the book that just shows what was a factory, and it's nothing but a burned out shell, an empty shell with some timbers in it, a foundation. All that was left, totally razed this huge building. But prior to the use of the atomic bombs in World War II, scientists actually came to Halifax and studied the Halifax explosion so they could better gauge what the impact was going to be of an atomic bomb on a populated area. So it did happen during wartime. I did say peacetime, but it wasn't an act of war. I mean, Halifax and this of course compounded the tragedy. I mean, Halifax had been sending ships and had been a embarking point for soldiers headed to war for most of the war, and then suddenly was tragically touched directly by what was happening overseas.
Hey listeners, I hope you're enjoying this conversation with Dean Jobb. Since the subject of today's episode is Nova Scotia, I felt like I would be remiss if I didn't tell you about one of my favorite podcasts, Nothing Ever Happens in Canada, hosted by my friend Canadian Girl, where she dives into some of Canada's most interesting history and mysteries. Check it out.
Most people think nothing ever happens in Canada, but we know this is simply not true. Do you like myths, legends, or learning about some of Canada's greatest moments in history? Then this is the podcast for you. Join me, Canadian Girl, every 2 weeks as we travel around Canada exploring haunted places, searching for lost gold mines, trying to solve some true crime, and we even stop to observe historical events and people every now and again. Come on over to the channel today and join the crew by hitting that subscribe button. You don't want to miss out on our next adventure. That's Nothing Ever Happens in Canada, available on most podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and more.
So you had mentioned the geography of Nova Scotia, being a peninsula that's almost an island, really, lends itself to a lot of seafaring, naval contact, and piracy. Can you tell us any stories about the seas around Nova Scotia?
Well, there is a famous case of a big ship called the Saladin that was on its way from Chile to England with a cargo of guano, which guano are layers and layers of bird droppings left on islands off the coast of Chile that were valued as fertilizer. Anyway, the captain of this ship had encountered another sea captain who was between jobs and was desperate to get back to England, took pity on him and took him on as a passenger. But this Captain Mackenzie of the Saladin would come to regret it, because the passenger captain, Fielding, very quickly decided he wanted to take over the ship. There couldn't be two captains. And he recruited enough of the crew to stage a mutiny. Kills the captain, few loyal sailors, their bodies are dumped overboard, and they decide they'll commandeer the ship and take it somewhere, maybe in Canada. Well, what happens over the ensuing days and weeks is distrust starts erupting within the mutineers, and fear that Fielding, the new captain who seized power, may not be done. He may have no intention of sharing some of the more valuable cargo, because there was money and some precious metals on board as well as cargo. And there ends up to be a second mutiny where some of the men rise up. They kill Fielding and his son and some loyal followers. This all becomes a Nova Scotia story, because what had not been counted on is there weren't enough men left to properly crew and run this huge ship. It ends up running aground in Nova Scotia, and rescuers go out and pull off the survivors. And they quickly realize this doesn't make sense. There doesn't seem to be a captain, and the excuse that he had fallen overboard in a storm doesn't wash. And a new story starts emerging as some of the people who were really not involved in either mutiny, but had been coerced into going along with it and had regretted it, started confessing. And ultimately, 4 men were convicted and hanged in Halifax for their roles in this piracy, which, as I said, was 2 piracies on the same ship, or 2 mutinies on the same ship. Yeah, and I mistakenly said piracy and mutiny in the same breath, and then that's because even though they're separate crimes, I mean, pirates don't have to be aboard the ship like a mutineer would rise up within one ship, but the terms were used interchangeably, and they were very similar crimes, obviously, because the object was to seize a cargo or seize a ship. You know, piracy and mutiny were problems throughout the age of sail, the 1800s, the real heyday of sailing ships. and no place was immune. While the Saladin case ends up in Nova Scotia by chance, by the ship running aground, there were there's a mutiny in Nova Scotia waters 20 years later that I deal with, and it was a serious crime, and of course it had serious implications for trade, for the security of cargoes, for the cost of goods. I mean, obviously, if ships were already facing enough challenges, and captains were dealing with the weather, with trying to get their cargoes through storms, there were enough losses without criminals actually creating more losses by seizing ships.
Well, if you have time for one more story,
Yeah.
we here in the U.S. Have just wrapped up a tumultuous election season. We'll call it that. That's still ongoing here, and kind of the if you talk to a person on the street, it's one of the worst elections we've ever had. We're glad it's over. And then I read a chapter from your book about chapter Death at the Polls, from 1859. And, it makes me think, not so bad.
Well, this is a Nova Scotia election. This is while Nova Scotia was still a British colony before it became part of Canada. And the backdrop to this was that our two main political parties, the Liberals and Conservatives, had become the parties of Catholics or Protestants. There was a huge sectarian divide in Nova Scotia, high tensions. A government had actually fallen over the issue of should there be separate schools for Catholics and Protestants, separate public funded schools. And the bitterness of this boiled over into the 1859 election. And at one particular polling station near Halifax, there was so much tension. There were a lot of government railway workers who were expected to support the government. They were Catholic. There were a lot of Protestants in the neighborhood, and that was now the party of the Liberals who were seeking power. And in the days leading up to it, there were threats, weapons, guns, axe handles, other weapons were stockpiled. And sure enough, two rival groups squared off at one polling station, and it turned into a riot. Men armed themselves with guns and weren't firing at each other. They were content to use the guns to beat each other, or to beat each other with clubs or throw rocks. But at one point, one of the Catholics came at a Protestant Liberal supporter with a large stone. Men, told him to back off, and he ended up leveling a gun and shooting him dead. So he was charged with murder, and about 10 of his people, of his friends and other people who were involved in the riot on the Liberal side, were charged as accessories, and it became a huge court case, and also a politicized court case. So you had sectarian hatred already. Protestant kills a Catholic. You have a political overtone. Liberal kills a conservative, and the government of the day having to decide, well, will it prosecute, and how hard will it prosecute this case that has really split the province open. And I wrote that story quite a while ago, but and this kind of violence wasn't unheard of in the 19th century elections, either in Canada or I believe the US. But it may resonate it certainly shows how bitter feelings and how high feelings can run at an election time.
Now, what did this do for the province? Did this further escalate tensions, or did this issue a wake-up call to we need to calm down?
Well, in the end, it was difficult to get a jury that wanted to convict, because strip it away, there was a good defense of self-defense here. I mean, a gun is more final than a large stone, perhaps. But in the midst of the riot, it at least didn't seem like premeditated murder, despite the fact people had armed themselves. And in the end, only one man stood trial and was acquitted. There were no lasting, I mean, there was bitterness from this, but it did not set the tone for future Nova Scotia elections. Despite, it was really a product of its time. The religious disputes and the religious prejudice that had underlaid it settled down. And again, it wasn't, there were no repeats that I was able to find in future elections. So it was really a coming together of these various forces that would put a group of Catholics and a group of Protestants in one place near where this railway was being built at a time when it wasn't going to take much to set off violence.
Well, this book has been a lot of fun to read. I mean, I know they're true stories, and a lot of times they're tragic in a lot of ways, but they're very interesting to learn about, and you write them in such a way that they're very, they're very engrossing. They're very kind of captivating with some action involved sometimes, and it's definitely an enjoyable read.
Well, that's another thing about true crime. I mean, it's a lot of the facts are grim, but I mean, some of it is stranger than fiction. The high-ranking, the top banking official of, again, the Bank of Nova Scotia, who systematically ripped off the bank for 40 years and was never caught. The magistrate in the early years of the 20th century in a small town, who was known for his wisecracking from the bench, who was more of a stand-up comic than a judge, which of course has a lot of humor, but it also, I found it was a way to talk about the professionalization of the judiciary in Nova Scotia, because here was a man who was renowned more for his common sense. He didn't have a legal degree. He didn't need a law degree or experience in those days. But by the time his career ended, the judges of this court were required to be legally trained. So it showed a development. But yeah, some of these stories, if they may have some grim black humor, but there's also some pretty unbelievable situations that end up before the courts.
All right. Well, do you have any other projects in the hopper?
I do, actually. I've got, I'm already talking to my publisher here in Nova Scotia about a sequel to Devious and Deadly, because it's been doing quite well. But I have another longer-term project that's coming out with Algonquin Books of Chapel Hill in the summer of 2021, so next summer. And it's another true crime story. It's called The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream, who was a little known but prolific Victorian-era serial killer. He was grew up in Canada, was trained at McGill University Medical School in Montreal, and started killing people. He started using what he had learned about poisons to poison mostly women. He killed a couple of women, at least, in Canada. When he had to flee Canada, he ended up in Chicago, and in Chicago, and then a place called Belvedere towards the Wisconsin border. He claimed another victim. In total, he killed at least 4 people in the Chicago area. Went to prison, and when he was released, when he was pardoned, which was a huge mistake, he went to England in the early 1890s and started poisoning women there. And he preyed on women in a rather poor neighborhood called Lambeth, and he became notorious as the Lambeth poisoner. And this was all only a couple of years after Jack the Ripper had eluded capture. So one of the questions I wanted to answer, and I hope I've answered in the book, is how could this man have gotten away with it for so long? I mean, he was even before the courts. He was acquitted of one of his murders. And it really led me to understand, or to dig into, the forensics, how crude they were at the time, but were developing, and also detection. Because ultimately, Scotland Yard had to track this guy down, not realizing and not really sure who it was. Being a doctor, it was hard for people to get their mind around that he should be a suspect. And ultimately, Scotland Yard sent an officer to North America, which was able to unravel these past 6 murders, if not more. So anyway, that's the story I tell next time. And it says a lot. Again, it's a window in the past. It says a lot about forensics and detection at the time, but also a lot about what life was like and the stigmatization of young women who were forced to go to a doctor like this and this heinous character. And because some of them were looking for abortions, or some of them were just had nowhere else to turn.
Which is really cool. You can extrapolate these broader commentary on society at the time through this story.
Yeah, and like I said, I think that's important because these are real people, these are real tragedies, but I think it's important to look for that lesson to be learned. So as I said, that there is the tragic and dramatic story of the murders this Dr. Crean commits, but I really thought that the story is, how does he get away with it so long? What does that say about the state of forensics detection society at the time? And ultimately, how was he brought to justice? And there was a thick Scotland Yard file I was able to consult at the archives in London that just showed the difficulty Scotland Yard had with its limited tools of the time of trying to figure out who was responsible. One of his murders for months even had been thought to be a suicide. So I was able to unravel all of the roadblocks and stumbling blocks that they'd faced. But ultimately, even after Jack the Ripper, it was hard for police in London to get their mind around the fact they were dealing with another serial killer. And that's another part of the story, is that this was a new phenomenon. It would be almost another century. It would be the 1980s before the term serial killer became common, because nobody really knew how to classify this kind of monster. And Crean very much was one of these first of this new breed of monster that we've come to, unfortunately, it has become so much more common, the serial killer.
Well, I think it's fair to say that you have a standing invitation to come back on the podcast when that comes out next year.
I'd appreciate it.
All right. Well, Dean, thank you again for taking the time to speak to us. Fascinating as always. The book again is Daring, Devious, and Deadly: True Tales of Crime and Justice from Nova Scotia's Past. And if people want to get a copy of the book or to learn more about you, where can they go?
Go to my website, www.deanjobb, and the last name is jobb.com. But it's available online. It's available Amazon, available everywhere, and certainly for order. If anyone out there is having any trouble finding it, send me an email through the website, or find me through Twitter, and I'll help you with it. But yeah, so it should be pretty easy to order.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the program.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Well, that wraps up another episode of the Can't Make This Up History Podcast. Big thank you again to Dean Jobb for coming back on the program. Again, his book, Daring, Devious, and Deadly: True Tales of Crime and Justice from Nova Scotia's Past. If you would like to get a copy of the book, I have a link to the book in the description of this episode in your podcast app. That takes you over to indiebound.org, and that will put you in touch with your local bookstore, who, of course, could definitely use your support going into this holiday season. And then again, if you want to listen to my other episode with Dean, there's also a link for that down in the description as well. As always, if you want to connect to the show on social media, I am on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all at CMTU History. I would love to hear from you, talk about history in general, or hear your thoughts about the podcast. If you are a fan of the podcast and you would be so inclined, please leave a review wherever you listen. I love seeing those reviews, and they are very helpful in getting word out about the podcast to people who haven't heard it before. And then if you're interested in getting access to some extra content, check out the show's Patreon page at patreon.com/CMTU History. I'm in the process of developing some good extra material there for you guys as well. Alright, that's it from me. Until next time, stay safe and take care.
This podcast is a part of Straight Up Strange Productions. Discover more shows like this one at straightupstrange.com.